was here last year giving a presentation on the Holy Shroud of Turin. We were very lucky to have the replica copy here as well, in the church just across the road. So today I was kindly asked to come and give the presentation on Our Lady of Guadalupe. I see some new brothers, I believe, and Father as well. We haven't met before. We can speak after the presentation, Father. So I'm assuming, hopefully, is this natural light that comes through the ceiling here? Is that, yeah, okay. So hopefully God will dull the weather just so that the slides that you have to see, you can see them. So the presentation, Our Lady of Guadalupe. First of all, before we begin the presentation, we sort of traverse through the approved Marian apparitions in the history of the church. Many of you are familiar with probably all of these apparitions, are certainly sort of main apparitions. The one that really got me when I was a teenager was the messages of Our Lady of Fatima. That was really the thing. It was because it was so relevant. It happened in 1917. And it's that kind of thing, you know, you go through your teens, your early 20s, and you start to learn more about your faith. And sadly today, there's very, very little by way of Catholic education in schools. So for me, there was a kind of learning curve having to go back through these approved apparitions. And of course, the apparition of Guadalupe, which was in the year 1531. A long time ago, really, but relatively recent, as it were. Before I begin a presentation, I always try and give the presentation an aim. And of course, the aim, you know, as well as, you know, imparting knowledge in a presentation and, you know, being on that sort of learning curve, the most important thing, if anyone leaves today, myself included, is to try and work towards your salvation. That's essentially what our faith is about. And sadly, today we live in this world where we have these erroneous teachings that somehow, you know, God's like a big teddy bear and nothing really matters, and it's not important to try and live the faith out or keep the commandments. We have this sort of real aberration about what God really is. So essentially, we listen to these presentations, we learn more about the faith to essentially try and save our souls. So part one, we're in the year 1531, Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mexico. To try and set a backdrop to what was happening in the Americas at this time, we have to first of all look at Europe, remembering that the Protestant Revolution was ravaging through Europe, principally by the key proponent who was Martin Luther in Germany. And then, of course, we had the Protestant revolutionaries in Britain as well at the same time. But 1517 was also the year when Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba discovered Mexico for the New World. I do believe there's a wee bit of providence in these dates, and it's not just a coincidence. But the thing about the Protestant Revolution is bearing in mind as well that at that point in history in Europe, the Catholics of Europe were ready for the revolution. Their hearts became softened to all the tendencies, the ambiances of the day. So when the revolution kind of hit, it did spread like wildfire. And we can kind of see that with a lot of things that are happening today. Society seems to get softened up to a point, and then when somebody proposes something radical, people just tend to go with it. And of course, not to mention the Islamic Crusades as well, which took place, or the Islamic expansion across Europe and beyond. And I always find people look at this in quite a perturbed way when we look at the number of Catholic Crusades that we had at this era in history. Between the 9th and the 12th century, we had 7 Crusades, but over 580, thanks brother, over 580 Muslim battles. And this is something we hear very, very little about in the media. And of course, this Islamic expansion, this wasn't something that was done in a peaceful, you know, love thy neighbour sense. This was ruled by the sword. Such was the case that even up into northern Spain, the Moors had conquered. And if it wasn't for the fight back from the Crusades, then we probably wouldn't even be having this meeting today. So here we are, Mexico in the 15th century, and as you can see, it's a long, long way from Europe. Mexico at this time was formed by a tribe, a colony known as the Aztecs. And historians tell us that they practiced paganism. They were kind of known as a death cult. They were very, very advanced as a civilization. When we watch those documentaries on the History Channel, you know, we see the Egyptians, you know, we look at different eras of history, we look at different peoples, and we see how they were very, very advanced in their mathematics, their technology, their whole sort of social situations. But for the Aztecs, they formed a death cult. And you're probably wondering, what does this painting depicting. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The Aztecs, being a paganistic culture, had their gods and goddesses. They were almost trying to emulate an authentic religion with these gods and goddesses, but of course it was completely paganistic. And you can see some of these depictions. I'm not even going to attempt to use the proper terminology to try and describe the onomatopoeias that we have to try and describe how we pronounce these expressions. They look very, very tough. But there's two gods that we can see here that were worshipped. In the year 1487, during the dedication of the Great Pyramid Temple under Emperor Ahizotl, we can see that this was kind of like again, going back to this emulation of religion, this was a feast day. And on this particular feast day, they would sacrifice many, many thousands of people from these large pyramid structures. Essentially, what they would do is they would take the victims, who would probably be from native tribes, they would bring them to these large temples, these sort of pyramid-shaped structures, and they would take them to the very top. And then it was from that point that the high priests would then sacrifice the victims, namely cutting out their hearts while they were still alive, decapitating them, and then throwing the bodies down the steps that we can see. And this would be done on feast days. Apparently this was done in hundreds, if not thousands, every day on particular feast days. And of course, pagans being pagans believed that somehow by doing this, they would appease the gods. They would appease the god of the sun. So each morning the sun would rise. They would appease the god of the moon, and so on and so forth. Now, pagans also had the goddesses, not just the gods, but the goddesses. And we had this sort of classic goddess who was called Tenantzin, who was known as wife of the serpent. She was thought to reside on a hill called Tepeyac Hill, which will become relevant in just a second. So here we are in the year 1464, ladies and gentlemen. The king of Texcoco was already describing how the true God would become known in Mexico. So there was almost a kind of prophecy in this. Montezuma, this was Emperor Montezuma, I beg your pardon. Montezuma's sister related in a dream in which she saw men with crosses on their heads arrive on the shores. Now, the high priest of Pilsen, we're now going back about 600 years. The high priest of Pilsen was expelled from Tula around 987. We know from historical records, if I can try and cement this together, there was a kind of civil revolution that took place in the year 987. And the high priest of Pilsen, he was expelled from the community. But there was some sort of folklore, some sort of prophecy that the high priest of Pilsen would somehow return one day to release people once again. Now here we have Emperor Montezuma in the painting on the right, and we can see that the pagans would have their kind of like a coat of arms with this whole kind of pantheon of gods and goddesses. And when an emperor became an emperor, he would embrace a particular god. And in this case, Montezuma embraced Quasicoat, who was known as a feather serpent. And we can see obviously the coat of arms here and how this looks like the picture on the left of Quasicoat, who was a kind of fiery serpent. And this is where it takes a twist, ladies and gentlemen. In the year 52, in the 52-year cycle of the Aztec calendar, I'm not even going to try and go into this to try and explain how this operates. Year 1 was dedicated to Quasicoat, the feather serpent, and his special feast day was Nine Wind. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're used to having our calendar January, February, March, April, May, and so on and so forth. The Aztecs had a different kind of organizational structure where the months would correspond to the names of animals, as we can see here. One crocodile was followed by two wind, house, lizard, and so on. And this formed the calendar of the Aztecs. So this was the thing. Here we are now. We're on April 22nd, 1519. This was Good Friday, which coincidentally or by providence was a one-reed nine wind. So in other words, this was on the feast day of Quasicoat. Okay. And of course, it was on this day to Mexico arrived the famous conquistador Hernando Cortes, who was a Spaniard explorer, sort of, conquistador, Thank you, brother. And it appears to be the case that because this coincided with the Good Friday of the Catholic calendar, the Aztec people almost saw this as a prophecy being fulfilled. They were suitably scared when the Spaniards had arrived on the shores, because they could see in Cortés the arrival of Tepiltzin, the high priest. I'm not saying they mistook him to be that person, but they were suitably reserved and found the whole situation quite prophetic somewhat, that they almost kind of surrendered to the Spaniards when they arrived. So there wasn't a direct conflict, because they almost saw it as a prophecy being fulfilled. We can see now the journey Cortés and his conquistadors would have made from the shores of the Gulf of Mexico to Texcoco, which is where we find a mountain known as Tepeyac Hill, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But of course, the conquistadors had arrived. They came from Catholic Spain. They saw in front of their very eyes a pagan culture, a death cult where they would sacrifice human victims. There's been some speculation as to whether or not there was also cannibalism. So, of course, Cortés quickly brought an end to this, but this did not come without conflict between the Aztecs and the Spaniards. But sadly, when Cortés arrived, he brought the Catholic religion, but didn't, with his men, necessarily bring the holiness that should be attached to the Catholic religion. So a lot of bad things happened. So we're not going to try and airbrush this point of history and say that these saintly Spaniards arrived and everything else. There was a lot of pillaging and theft and, rape and murders, and a lot of barbaric things took place from the Spaniards towards the Aztecs. So a battle did ensue for several years. Some sort of catalyst was needed to try and bring the Catholic faith in its authentic form to Mexico. Give Cortés his due, he was a devout Catholic. One of the first things he did establish was the solemn celebration of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass on one of the high altars that we'd looked at earlier, one of these high sort of pyramid structures. If we were to go to Mexico today, this is probably what we would find, more like a museum exhibit now. We see these pyramid structures where the sacrifices would be carried out. And of course, it's very, very sanitized now. It's quite hard to believe that victims, young and old, would be rolling down these steps after being barbarously killed. And this is essentially all that remains of the Aztec cult. Of course, these pyramid structures, they didn't just have one sort of altar. Some of them would have 3 or 4 altars. So not just having one priest carrying out sacrifice, human sacrifice, there could be 4 priests at one time with people, descending from the steps that we see. Very tall structures as well. So what was the catalyst for the conversion of Mexico? Because with the arrival of the Spaniards, the conquistadors, it just wasn't enough to bring the Aztec people into the Catholic religion. And this is kind of where the story begins with Guadalupe and this man here. In 1487, 6 miles from the Great Pyramids, there lived a 13-year-old boy named Quetzalcoatl. In 1523, on the very ruins of the Great Pyramid, he was baptized Juan Diego. So this young boy who was received into the Catholic faith, this native Indian, moving forward 57 years, is now a man in his middle age and is now about to encounter the Blessed Virgin Mary. So we read the story that Juan Diego was attending to an uncle who had been unwell, and he would normally take a route past the hill that we spoke about, Tepeyac Hill. And it was on one particular day, it happened to be the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, December 9th, when he could hear what sounded like a heavenly choir coming from the apex of the hill, and a voice petitioning him to come to the top of the hill. And of course, Juan Diego duly observed and then made his way to the top of the hill when he could hear the heavenly choir, and of course, then have this beautiful encounter with the Immaculate Virgin Mary. We read the discourse here that was recorded from Juan Diego, and there's a lovely maternal, sort of gentle, comforting word from the Blessed Virgin Mary. Dear little son, I love you. I want you to know who I am. I am the Virgin Mary, mother of the one true God, of him who gives life. He is Lord and creator of heaven and of earth. I desire that there be built a temple at this place where I want to manifest him, make him known, give him to all my people through my love, my compassion, my help, and my protection. I truly am your merciful mother and the mother of all who dwell in this land, and of all mankind, of all those who love me, of those who cry to me, and of those who seek and place their trust in me. Here I shall listen to their weeping and their sorrows. I shall take them all to my heart, and I shall cure their many sufferings, afflictions, and sorrows. So run now to Tecnatitlan and tell the Lord Bishop all that you have seen and heard. So, of course, Juan Diego was very, very inspired by this. He was filled with the zeal of the Holy Spirit, as it were, and made his way straight to see the bishop. And, of course, when he met the bishop, I guess in those days it would be difficult to meet the bishop. You would have to probably go through layers and levels of clergy until eventually getting a personal meeting with the bishop. I guess nothing's really changed nowadays, is it? So here we have the bishop. The presiding bishop at the time was Bishop Zumarraga. And Juan Diego makes his way to tell him that the Blessed Virgin requests that a church be built. Of course, the bishop was in disapproval and disbelief about Juan Diego's claim. So Juan Diego duly returned to the Virgin Mary, completely deflated, asking what he should do at this point to try and get the bishop to be persuaded. So Our Lady told Juan Diego if he was to return to her the following day, she would therefore give him the sign that would be needed. So Juan Diego, you beg your pardon, there's an apparition in between that. On that second apparition, Our Lady consoled Juan Diego and told him to again return to see the bishop the following day, which he duly did. So Juan Diego, once again, having the bishop in disbelief, the bishop then says, okay, if what you're saying is true, Juan Diego, go back to the Blessed Virgin Mary and ask her to give us a sign so that we may believe that what you're saying is the truth. Here we have a painting of the bishop saying Mass. So here we have the third apparition, ladies and gentlemen. So Our Lady asks Juan Diego to return the following day for her to impart, to give a sign to Juan Diego, to then take to the bishop that she is telling the truth and that Juan Diego is not making up the story, so that the bishop will believe. Now, the story kind of takes a twist here, because we're now on the Monday. Remember, the apparitions began on December 9th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. We're now on the Monday. Now, Juan Diego, in his innocence, knows that he has to nurse his dying uncle. So he makes a point of avoiding Tepeyac Hill on that day, because he knows by avoiding Tepeyac Hill, where the Virgin Mary is, he can then attend to what he sees as the ultimate priority, which is to attend to his dying uncle. And tries to reconcile that in his heart by saying to himself, the Virgin Mary will understand. Of course, Tuesday then arrives, December 12th. The uncle is now dying at this point. So Juan Diego once again avoids Tepeyac Hill and the encounter with Our Lady to find a priest to attend to the last rites for his dying uncle. But of course, Our Lady sees everything, doesn't she? And she knows his plight. So while Juan Diego is trying to avert, is trying to avoid the hill region, the Blessed Virgin Mary in her Majesty, descends from the hill and says, Juan Diego, what is wrong? And of course, he's like that little innocent schoolboy, he's almost told a white lie. He then explains his dilemma. And of course, the Blessed Virgin Mary listens to everything and assures him that his uncle will be fine and his uncle will be cured. And of course, the Blessed Virgin Mary then instructs Juan Diego to climb Tepeyac Hill. Now, bearing in mind this is December, she tells him that when he goes to a particular part of the hill, he will find flowers. And the flowers growing there will be the sign that the bishop would require, especially the flowers which were Castilian roses, which we'll mention in just a second. So Juan Diego, this was Mexicans would wear I'll hold this just now in case it interrupts the microphone. Mexicans would wear a Tilma cloth, or a poncho it's sometimes called. And that was a practical work thing. You could wrap it, you could tie it around your neck, and then you could hold things in it, and they were made from a sort of cactus plant, the Maggie fibre plant. They were very, very robust. So Juan Diego used this to collect the flowers which Our Lady had told him would be there in this sort of fashion. So I can imagine, ladies and gentlemen, he would have done something like this, picked all these flowers and then kind of wrapped them up in this sort of fashion, and then made his way back to the Blessed Virgin Mary to show her the flowers and to have her approval before he made his way to see the bishop. Of course, the Blessed Virgin Mary, in her maternal, loving, kind, aesthetic way, was able to rearrange the flowers, because Juan Diego, you can just imagine that would be me, wouldn't it? You know, just flowers are all crushed and everything. And of course, Our Lady rearranged the flowers so they looked pleasing to the eye, and then instructed him to go and see the bishop. And of course, at this point, as we'd mentioned earlier, the uncle, Juan Bernardino, was duly cured right at that particular moment. So the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to him. He was dying, and restored him to full life and health. And of course, the next part of the story is where Juan Diego then makes his way with the Tilma cloth and the flowers to then see the bishop. And of course, at this point, he's really filled with zeal, because he's looking at these lovely flowers, and being December, these flowers shouldn't really have been grown there at all. It wasn't just Castilian roses. There was lots of different lush sort of coloured flowers and what have you. We read the account. He makes his way in to see the bishop. He's full of energy. He says, I have the sign. May I show you? And of course, the bishop gives his approval. And Juan Diego goes in to see the bishop. He says, I have the sign. Please accept these from Our Lady. And of course, to the bishop's astonishment, he sees materializing on the cloth the image of Our Lady, as we know of Guadalupe. But of course, Juan Diego's looking at the roses and kind of mistakenly thinking that the bishop is looking at the roses. But because Juan Diego's standing in this posture, he's not quite seeing what's just materialized on the cloth. When we read the account, the image, it physically materialized on the cloth in front of the eyes of the bishop and several other people who were present. And of course, that was the miracle. But the double jeopardy, as it were, the double miracle, should I say, was that we have the Castilian roses, which happen to be the bishop's favourite rose as well. So the scene was filled with awe. And of course, the bishop was in tears. He was on his knees. He was asking Juan Diego for forgiveness for disbelieving his story. And this was essentially how the image came to be. And of course, at this point, the bishop completely obeyed the request. He made decisions thereof to build the church on Tepeyac Hill, right at the foot of the hill where Juan Diego had met the Blessed Virgin Mary. And this, of course, this is recorded in many, many sort of manuscripts. This particular manuscript was from 1997. This was Father Savius Glada, Society of Jesus. He had produced a new document that had been found recounting the story that I've just intimated to you. And this document was from the year 1551. Of course, with every incredible religious relic, whether it's a shroud, whether it's Padre Pio's mittens, there tends to always be miracles associated with this supernatural phenomena. And of course, December 26th, several weeks after the appearance of Our Lady of Guadalupe and the materialization of the Tilma, the first miracle took place when the native Indians were celebrating the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. One of the native Indians, I think they were having celebrations, sort of javelin throwing and different things. They would obviously perform these things that were central to their culture. and one of them was fatally wounded with a spear. They then brought the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, placed it over the deceased person, and of course his life was restored. The bigger miracle being the millions who are then received into the Catholic Church from there on, the millions and millions of native Indians. And we spoke about that catalyst that was needed, because whilst the conquistadors had done great work, they'd ended the human sacrifice, they still needed that gift from heaven to seal it. So the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, well, we talk about Codex Guadalupe, there's information in the image. The image is an icon. Actually, it's not a photograph of the Blessed Virgin, it's an icon that's relevant to the cultural people at that point in time. And we're just going to go through some details regarding that. First of all, Mary appears as a beautiful young Indian maiden with a look of love, compassion and humility. Her hands folded in prayer and reverence to the Almighty God. Her face is also not unlike that of a Jewish maiden. Her rose dress adorned with jasmine flower, 8 petal flowers and 9 heart flowers, symbolic to the Aztec culture, is that of an Aztec princess. Her blue mantle symbolised the royalty of the gods, and the blue colour symbolised life and unity. Mary stands in front of and hides the sun, but the rays of the sun still appear around her, signifying she is greater than the sun, the greatest of the native divinities, but the rays of sun still bring light. 12 rays of the sun surround her face and head. She stands on the moon, supported by an angel with wings like an eagle. To the Aztec, this indicates her superiority to the moon god, the god of night, and her divine regal nature. And here we are, we recall the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, one of the most famous sort of sea battles in history. The second Archbishop of Mexico had an exact copy of the holy image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, sent to King Philip II, who in turn gave it to André de Ria, one of the 3 principal admirals of the fleet, who placed it in his cabin during the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. When the Armada went from file to line abreast and attacked on the morning of October 7th, 1571, the blue standard of Our Lady of Guadalupe was also flying from the masthead of Don John of Austria's flagship. The Battle of Lepanto, again, it was that great standoff between Muslims, Moors, and the Catholic Church at that time. If this battle had been lost, the Catholic Church essentially historically would have been defeated. We might as well be Muslims just now. The Catholics were completely outnumbered, by 100-fold, terribly, terribly outnumbered, and yet the battle was won, because meanwhile back in the church, back in Rome, the Pope, the laity, everybody was praying the rosary for the defeat of Islam, because they knew what was going to lie ahead if the Mohammedans, as they were called then, had conquered. But the battle was won victoriously, and many Catholics attribute that to Our Lady of Guadalupe. Mexico City today, has anyone been to Mexico to see the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe? Okay. I had a friend that was there just several months ago. She says it really was. It was something else. This is the old cathedral, ladies and gentlemen, Our Lady of the Angels Church. This was the original church that held the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. I don't know if it's the picture. I think it's subsiding. I don't know if that's the reason they built the new church. This is a new church. I prefer the older church. I kind of see it like Victorian architecture versus IKEA or something. There's just an emptiness, isn't there? That we see in the beauty of old structures. And this is where the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is now kept. We can see it above the altar, right in the centre. Apparently there's some sort of conveyor belt thing. You can go into the conveyor belt to go past it. This was going back to the old basilica. This is in the 1920s. This is the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe above the high altar. Of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe has not been spared its attacks through history. A Freemasonic attack took place in the year 1921. On November 14, 1921, a bomb with 29 sticks of dynamite was planted by Luciano Perez, a Spanish anarchist, under the direction of Freemasonic forces. And a flower arrangement on the altar under the Tilma, which exploded and broke the marble altar rail. The marble floor and even the windows 150 metres from the explosion. So it was really one heck of a blast. Neither the Tilma nor the normal glass that protected the image was damaged or broken. The only damage near the tilma was a heavy brass crucifix, which we see in the picture. It was twisted by the blast, and since 1993, the tilma was protected by bulletproof glass in the Basilica of Guadalupe. So we look at the damage to the heavy brass crucifix, and yet, miraculously, the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe was spared. The sort of second part of the talk, science in the tilma. So we now kind of move to the modern world and the sort of technological revolution where we can measure things and try and ascertain more detail from, especially from religious artifacts from the past. So there are numerous inexplicable aspects to the Holy Tilma of Guadalupe, and I'm going to touch just upon a few of them. And this by no means is exhaustive. There's so many areas, and normally following a presentation like this, maybe when the audience will make contributions, they'll say, oh, what about this or what about that? And I kind of try and stick to the details that we really just know are absolute kind of matter of fact. And then if there's any speculation or other things, we can open that up at the end. So first of all, no reproduction can do justice to the original. When we look at the original image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, it's been said by many a photographer that it's very, very difficult to capture its beauty in a reproduction. The lifespan we spoke about the tilma cloth is no more than 20 years max. The Maggie fibre is a fibre that essentially just deteriorates. And yet this tilma cloth, as we know, is over 500 years old. Is almost 500 years old. Dr. Jose Bartolacci in the 1780s, I beg your pardon, had copies made of the Maggie fibre tilma. So he took some tilmas made from the Maggie fibre and painted some images on to see how long they would last. Of course, after just 7 or so years, they were almost completely perished because of the process of decomposition. A near invisible seam runs the entire length of the tilma cloth. So when we look at the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, there's a seam runs right down the middle of that. It's very, very finely woven, so it's difficult to see when we look at it, especially from a distance. In the year 1936, Dr. Richard Kuhn, who was a Nobel Prize winner, on examining some fibres taken from the tilma, could not establish the origin of the dyes used. And I guess if Dr. Kuhn was able to ascertain what the dyes were, then I guess we could probably say there wouldn't be any controversy because it would then be the product of an artist, so it wouldn't be controversial as such. Without reading all of this in detail, just some more salient points. Here we have Dr. Philip Callahan, a biophysicist at the University of Florida, who's an expert in infrared photography. Moving on to the bold print, he photographed the image under infrared light and scanned at very high resolutions. After processing the images, he discovered that portions of the face, hand, robe and mantle had been created in almost one step with no sketches or correction and no visible brush strokes. So all these things have been an enigma to science as we understand it. The image changes in colour slightly according to the angle of viewing. This phenomenon, as you know, is known as iridescence. We see it in feathered peacocks and what have you. Scientists were unable to find any trace of paint, residue or dye of any sort, and yet the colours seem to maintain their luminosity and brilliance. So essentially what produced the colours on Juan Diego's tilma cloth and how they were applied still remains a mystery to this day. There are no brush strokes. Again, had there been brush strokes similar to the Holy Shroud of Turin, there would be no controversy. It would be debunked many, many years ago. There's been no sketching, no sizing. You know, when we look at some of those famous paintings from Da Vinci or Michelangelo, under infrared, we can see the lines where they've done the sizing. You know, they've drawn out the picture before they've painted it. We don't find anything like this when we analyse this under infrared. The front side of the tilma is perfectly smooth. It's almost like silk, it's like glass. And yet the opposite side is very, very coarse and rough. The tilma is very, very thin. It's almost paper thin and is partially obscured through natural light. The rough texture of certain points of the tilma gives the image, especially the face, a kind of three-dimensional depth. The stars on the mantle appear to match the night sky of December 12, 1531. This was information that emerged 50 or so years ago when Dr. Hernandez, and a Mexican astronomer, using kind of software that we have now, we can kind of see what was going on even back then using modern technology. We can look at the constellations. We can go back to any day any month, you know, we can go back literally centuries and find out what's going on in the night sky. Maybe just as a kind of side note as well, there's a fantastic documentary, maybe near Christmas time, if you like a good sort of religious documentary at Christmas. A documentary's been produced, ladies and gentlemen, called The Star of Bethlehem. And we're talking about this modern cosmology, technology software where we can look at the night sky. And a particular researcher has been able to look at the night sky on December 25th, you know, which we believe to be the Christmas Day, the birth of Christ, the actual date, and not just something that's symbolic. And similarly, it does the same thing with Good Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'm not even going to say any more regarding that. So if you're looking for some good viewing, it's called The Star, and you'll find it on, possibly on YouTube, The Star of Bethlehem. So despite thousands of fibres being removed and as relics over the years, the image, like the Shroud of Turin, is still extraordinarily intact. Studies carried out in both 1751 and 1946 confirm an inexplicable area of gold that seems to be woven with the tilma, where we see flowers on the tilma. This was probably the thing that really sort of captivated me when I was learning about the tilma. I remember someone telling me this. I was probably in my kind of late teens, and they'd give me the account. Obviously, it was very vague in my mind, and then they spoke about this inexplicable scientific findings with the tilma. And one particular aspect the person was telling me about was the eyes of the Blessed Virgin Mary of the image of Guadalupe. When we look at the right eye very close up, we can see what might be an anomaly. It might be just a coincidence, but we can see what possibly looks like a person with a beard. Now, again, you might say, okay, that's just, you know, that's close up. We're seeing sort of pixelation here in the image. So we can see what appears to be someone looking at us, the eyes, the set of the eyes, the shadows, and then, of course, the beard. When we look at pictures of Juan Diego, sort of paintings of Juan Diego from that time, I would be, without going in 100%, I'd say, yeah, that kind of looks pretty similar, doesn't it, to Juan Diego? In the year 1929, Alfonso Marquez, who was the official photographer of the old Basilica of Guadalupe, Mexico City, found what seemed to him to be a clear image of a bearded man reflected in the right eye of the Virgin. Initially, he did not believe what was before his eyes. How could it be? A bearded man inside the eyes of the Virgin. May 29th, 1951, Jose Carlos Salinas Chavez, examining a good photograph of the face, rediscovers the image of what clearly appears to be a bearded man reflected in the right eye of the Virgin. But he also locates it in the left eye too. So what's the chances of that, of the same image appearing in both eyes? March 27th, 1956, Dr. Javier Torrellano Bueno, a prestigious ophthalmologist, notices the same anomaly, and so on and so forth. And we have this unfolding of the image of the eyes of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which what appears to be evident is a bearded man, aka Juan Diego. And many ophthalmologists notice this same anomaly. It's been said that, as well as Juan Diego, in the image we also see what appears to be Bishop Zumarraga and several others who were in attendance when the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe materialized on the tilma of Juan Diego. So this, we're told, is the bishop, and we can see how an artist has used a kind of bit of artistic license to try and recreate people who were present, including, of course, Juan Diego. Now, again, I'm not jumping into that 100%, but it's certainly worth investigating. So I'm not saying categorically, yes, that's the bishop, of course it is, but if it's an anomaly, my goodness, it's one heck of an anomaly. And probably a final backdrop to the story, because we talk about Our Lady of Guadalupe, but Guadalupe's not a place in Mexico. So where did the title Guadalupe come from, Our Lady of Guadalupe? Well, this is a very interesting backdrop to the story, which precedes the story by centuries. St. Luke the Evangelist, who was known as the first icon painter, carved a black Madonna statue following his many meetings with the Virgin Mary. This was placed in his coffin when he died and was moved from Greece to Constantinople. The statue was removed and given to the Emperor Constantius II in the 4th century. So here we have St. Luke carving a black Madonna, and then this is given to the Emperor in the 4th century, Constantius. More than 200 years later, the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, 582 to 602, gifted the statue to Gregorius Anichus, the Pope's ambassador, and the future Pope Gregory the Great of Rome. Furthermore, in order to show just the massiveness of God's plans, the basilica in which the statue was held was constructed on the orders of a previous apparition which took place on August 5th, 352, by the title of Our Lady of the Snows. And there's a connection to be made here. The statue would remain on the basilica's high altar for over a century, until it had to be hidden by clerics due to the Islamic invasion of Spain by the Arabs in the 700s. According to tradition, the clerics confiscated the statue and took it to Extremadura, burying it deep in a cave, which was then not to be found until some 600 years later. And we have this again, this artist's depiction of a farmer. We'll just mention this in the following slide. A farmer named Gil Cordero, searching for his lost cow one day, found the cow dead near a stream. The stream was called Guadalupe. So, of course, this is in Spain. The actual meaning of the word Guadalupe is very convoluted, and nobody agrees on the true meaning. Some believe it is a mix of Arabic and Latin to mean river of the wolf, or just Latin for the same definition, while others believe it is purely Arabic and means river of light. The last definition is that of hidden channel. Whatever it means, it was certainly not a word that the Aztecs would have understood, this word Guadalupe. Cordero's cow miraculously regained life following his brief encounter with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And despite being mocked, as was Juan Diego, he eventually persuaded the local clerics to dig the ground on the request of the Blessed Virgin Mary. When the debris and stones were removed, a cave was found, and inside was discovered the statue, alongside relics of St. Fulgensis and St. Florentina. Lastly, a bell was also found inside the cave, together with an ancient document that discussed the origins of it. A chapel was built on the holy ground, and the statue rested there. And this is a church that is there today. And this is the Black Madonna that was carved. We obviously have the Black Madonna, but this was a statue that's believed to have been carved by St. Luke himself, which became known as the Madonna of Guadalupe. Now, where would we get the connection between Spain and Mexico? This is where it kind of takes a wee turn again. Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Christopher Columbus, the great explorer, was from that region of Extremadura and visited the statue of the Black Madonna of Our Lady of Guadalupe many times, and also visited on his return from the Americas. So we could pose the question, did he bring this word Guadalupe to the Americas? And this is where we end up with Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico. So why the name Guadalupe? Well, the first theory is the Spaniards noting the black-toned Lady of Tepeyac Hill associated her with the apparition of Our Lady in Spain. Second theory, Our Lady, when she appeared to Juan Diego's uncle, called herself Quatapula, one who crushes the head of the stone serpent. Maybe a connection. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the second word, meaning something like she who emerges from the region of light, like the eagle from fire. Both words, when pronounced, homonyms of Guadalupe, and thus the theory is that the Spaniards misinterpreted the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs and attributed the name Guadalupe to the apparitions. There's some sort of crossover here. Will we ever know? Who knows? But of course, we read in Genesis, I will put enmities between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel. For further information, ladies and gentlemen, there's a fantastic documentary on YouTube. I can leave this slide back up later if anybody wants to take a snapshot of it. The documentary is relatively recent. I think it's maybe about 9-10 years ago. It's narrated by Jim Caviezel, the actor who played Christ in the Passion of the Christ. It's got some great audio visuals. Sometimes when I'm giving this presentation, I could almost say one day, shall we just watch the documentary instead? Because it's very, very well done. It's 50 minutes long, and it just really goes through in so much, it elaborates so well the apparitions of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And of course, finally, in summary, just to look again over some of the more salient aspects of the presentation. The catalyst to bring Mexican Aztecs into the Catholic faith was exclusively through the manifestation of the Tilma cloth to Juan Diego in 1531. And of course, also, as well as uniting the people, it also restored the faith of the conquistadors, because many of them had become lukewarm in their Catholic faith. The origin of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is inexplicable using the current scientific method of analysis. And of course, it's not very politically correct to say this nowadays, but there is true and false religion. And God wishes man to follow the true religion. Of course, the true religion is the Holy Catholic Church that was founded by the God-man Jesus Christ in 33 AD when he roamed the earth. And this is the true faith. And I try and sort of draw the analogy of Marks and Spencer's and Poundland. Where would you rather shop? If you want the fullness of the truth, it's only to be found within the deposit of the Catholic faith. And some people put their hand up and say, does that mean that non-Catholics can't be saved? Well, they can be saved, but they're not being saved by being non-Catholics. Through the grace of the church, they could be saved. But to guarantee salvation, we have to have the fullness of truth. And of course, that's through the Holy Catholic religion. And sadly, there are quarters of the church today that don't preach that and somehow think that all these erroneous paths somehow lead to God, which they don't. And it's a very bold statement, but it was a bold statement that came from the Divine Master himself when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one goes to the Father except through me. And of course, Our Lady of Guadalupe became known as the patroness of the unborn child, probably precisely because of the human sacrifice of the day of the Aztecs and the many countless native Indians who were sacrificed on those high altars. And the modern sacrifice, as we know, is the sacrifice of the innocent unborn child in the womb today. Our Lady of Guadalupe, pray for us. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. Thank you. And I'm quite happy to take some questions. Another wee thing as well, I'll perfect that eventually. I actually attended a talk some years ago, and I'm trying to remember how the presenter did this. He took the cloth and he wrapped the roses up with it, and then he just did something, and the image appeared. It was an overlapping of the fabric. Whereas, of course, what I did, I really shouldn't let you in on the secret, shouldn't I? But I sat the cloth down, went through a few more slides to distract you. And then, of course, I had a cloth prepared with extra roses with the image. The cloth that you were looking at was just a small reproduction of the Tilma cloth, which I use, obviously, to elaborate on the presentation and to try and make it more visually interesting. But we actually have a replica copy of the original size-for-size image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which I'm just going to show you just now. This it only arrived just recently, and please God, I'm hoping to do with this what I did with the Shroud of Turin, and encase it in some sort of nice ornate frame with some glass and hopefully backlight it as well. So I'll hold this up just now and let you see it. I can possibly, as I say, it kind of arrived in haste just the other day, but we'll have a look at it. I could maybe even just tape it to the top of the projector screen if you want to just crack them up and spend some time in front of it. So before we finish off, again, thank you very much for your undivided attention. Thank you to Father. Thank you to the brothers. Is there any questions? Is there any more relevant points I've neglected to mention? Would anybody like to ask any questions? Yes? Yes, brother?
I was just wondering if you could repeat some of the symbolism of, you mentioned, you went through a few points of what parts of her mantle and what parts of the image represented what, like the sun, for example.
Yes.
That was very interesting, but I didn't catch all of it.
I'll just take it from this picture here so we can look at Our Lady, because again, there's what you've essentially, today we've kind of heard some of the more salient points, but not all of the main points that would have been recognised by the Aztec Indians. For example, Our Lady in the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which spoke about the symbolic in the sense of, for example, she has bent knee, you know, as you see her sort of in this posture, indicating she's moving, but she's very, very humble, according to Aztec mythology. She's also she has this brown, can you see this brown sort of lapel bow thing that we see here? In Aztec culture, this indicates that she's actually with child. In fact, it's something I actually have to add to this, because that's a very relevant point. She's obviously, her head's bent, she's in prayer. We spoke about her blue garment indicating the regal nature of the Mother of God, and this was a blue also symbol the colour blue in the Aztec culture is something very regal nature, something very holy. We have the kind of undoing. I guess the symbolism is that we have Our Lady as a native Indian, and the icon that we see, she is undoing the god, the sun god, as it were. She crushes the god of the moon that's under her feet. So we have this sort of symbolism whereby the pagan culture that has existed beforehand has kind of been undone in a symbolic way. There's maybe some controversial points. For example, it's believed that some of these sun rays that you see, some of these have been painted on. So I'm not going to neglect to mention that. There's, you know, through the centuries, people have painted onto the top of our image of Guadalupe. The original image in itself might not have looked completely like that. So some people will look at that and say, right, that's exactly how Our Lady left that when it materialised on the cloth, but that's actually not the case. And the paintings that we do, the paint that we do find, which is paint to embellish some of the sun rays, the paint is actually peeling from the cloth now. So we can compare the natural paint, the synthetic paint that's been added to the painted onto the cloth with the unknown substance that's there. Does that answer your question, brother? Okay. Any more points? And I'll just, yes?
Is there a picture without the synthetic paint?
Could you repeat that, please?
Is there a
Visualization, yes.
Of the original painting without this addition?
Yeah, right, it's a good point. So the gentleman's saying, do we have an original, what we might see as being the original without the add-ons? We actually kind of, we do as paintings. Again, it's something that I might want to add to the talk further down the line. So I think when we see the original, we see less rays of the sun, for example. We don't see them as pronounced. And possibly the angel holding the Our Lady at the bottom, Our Lady stands on the angel, is also an artist depiction as well. So these are things that we've, certainly things that we have to not neglect to mention, because I think it's important to try and undo as well the difference between that which is inexplicable and that which is explicable by sort of modern methods of painting. Is there any other points? I'm going to just hold up the original image now and hopefully have you know. Oh, when you say, right, this is the exact size, it's quite big actually. Juan Diego must have been quite a strong person to carry this heavy Tilma about. Yes?
The parting of her hair was a sign of virginity.
The parting of the hair, thank you, was a sign of virginity as well. There's really a whole list of symbolic things which I will absolutely do, I think, further down the line with this presentation, because I think these are points that are definitely the more relevant points. Yes?
I just want to ask the pictures of Juan Diego and the Aztecs and so on. Are they taken from like a specific book, or is it from like from various sources? So it's like a storybook of like the discovery of the discovery, like the vision and so on. And is it like a book that's been taken from?
Yeah, it's a good. So the gentleman was asking that, we've seen some artist depictions of Juan Diego, and was there an artist saying, "Come in, Juan Diego, sit down, please, and we'll just paint you." Clearly, many of these paintings came further down the line, centuries after. We have records from that time. I would imagine that the information from Mexico itself is kind of limited, but we would probably have, just like, for example, we do like Bishop Zumarraga, the picture you did see of him that was a painting done at that time of Bishop Zumarraga. I'm assuming that, hands up, it's not something I've fully investigated. Do we actually have an accurate depiction of Juan Diego from 1531? That would be certainly something I would have to look further into.
I like the picture
Yes.
Just things like where
Yeah, so these, yeah, but yes, and these have came from, they actually came from, well, many of them came from online, but I've got a very, very good textbook somebody had given me of the story of Guadalupe, and it's got brilliant artistic illustrations. So some of the, pretty much all of these have came from that book. I've just scanned them and used them. But they're very, very well done, I think. I think especially for children, it's good to try and narrate the story with sort of audio visuals in particular, particularly visual images. Yes, brother?
I think you had a slide, the words which Our Lady spoke to Juan Diego.
Yes.
It was very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, she talks about being our mother, I think.
Yes, the mother of the, yes. Yeah, it's just very, very gentle, isn't it? The whole discourse from Our Lady. I think as well, for me, I'll just find this, ladies and gentlemen. Going back to what we'd mentioned earlier on about I don't really want to get into the realm of true apparitions and false apparitions, but there's something authentic, isn't there, about when the Blessed Virgin Mary speaks. And we look at, the words here. This is almost 500 years old. It's very, very, it's not long, it's not poetic as such, but it's very, very gentle and loving. And it kind of fills you with confidence that Our Lady is our refuge, and she's here to assist us. And I think we can see this. There's obviously nothing theologically wrong in that, but it's just a very, very gentle, loving message. I think we tend to find that when Our Lady appears, she is someone who, she does say very little, doesn't she? I think we also have that kind of, it draws parallels with when we see visionaries who aren't believed. Hesitate to use the word visionary, when someone receives an apparition from heaven, and they kind of are always, generally always kind of met with contempt or disbelief. The thing with apparitions, again, without sort of delving into that, but I would always say to people, you can apply the Catholicism 101. You kind of know if there's something theologically wrong with an apparition, you would know immediately that it's suspect, even if it bears great fruit. If there's something theologically that contradicts what we believe, then it can't be true. That would be a presentation for another time, brother.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, brother.
I was just wondering if you knew of anyone that's actually had a conversion through investigating the science behind the Tilma. If you actually know of any, if you have any knowledge of anyone that's actually had a conversion and has attributed it to actually looking into the science behind it.
I would say, brother, that I think that certainly I haven't met anyone personally. Obviously, when Our Lady of Guadalupe became established in Mexico, we know there were millions of people, millions of native Indians received into the faith. In answer to your question, I believe in this modern age. If I've got friends who are, I've got friends who are believers, I've got friends who are on the fence riders and what have you. But I think that not just being one kind of particular event, apparition, for example, you could meet someone. I haven't met anyone who says, "Oh, I'll tell you what it is, Henry. I read Our Lady of Guadalupe. I've read the science, and I just want to be baptized now." I think there's almost a cascade of events. So it could be the Tilma cloth, it could be the Shroud of Turin, working with each other, as it were. These kind of truths that we find. I'm kind of always hesitant as well. I think that probably what I do, I don't know if God would approve and say, well, that's the right approach, Henry. I guess there's many approaches. When I'm vested in telling people this is true, because I genuinely believe it is true, similar to the Shroud of Turin. But I think we have to be careful that we don't just sort of hang our hats on Our Lady of Guadalupe, because tomorrow someone could find something in this which then deems it to be a forgery. It's not an article of faith. It's not an article of faith. The Shroud of Turin, the Holy Shroud of Turin, it's not an article of faith. But I do believe it is the genuine cloth that wrapped Christ in the tomb, but it's not an article of faith, because tomorrow someone may find, something wrong with it, or something that's deems it to be a forgery. I don't believe that will ever happen, but I wouldn't try and sell somebody the faith, as it were, just through something that's material, because clearly the faith is immaterial, isn't it? But I think these are great tools. The Shroud of Turin, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the apparitions of Fatima, all these things are wonderful because we kind of live in a culture, as we all know, we've all been there, we've had 50, 60 years of deprivation, Catholically. I think back to my Catholic schooling, it was, and I don't like to be cold and cynical, it was awful. It's just awful. There was nothing there. There was nothing by way of religious education. In fact, speaking about the Shroud of Turin, that was my introduction through one lesson of all the 6 years at Catholic school. One God lover school teacher, a languages teacher, told us about the Shroud of Turin. And this was the days before the internet. So she was trying to describe it, and then I think she did have a picture of it, and it was like, what? And it was only many years later, I was in a bookshop in Glasgow, and so that's a thing, the Shroud of Turin. What is that? What was that again? The cloth? And of course, then it's like the domino effect. You think, oh my goodness, this is true, this is real. But great tools to evangelise. Any more points before we round off? Yes.
Her belt, representing her that she was pregnant.
Yes.
Apart from the fact that she's representing life, and the Aztec culture was a culture of death.
Yes.
Was there a deeper meaning to that to the Mexican people?
I honestly don't know, to be quite honest. I don't know if anybody can contribute to that point. There was.
The women of the day, they wore the black belt to
Mm-hmm.
indicate they were pregnant.
Right, so black belt specifically won't indicate one was pregnant.
Not the actual, what they did.
Yeah, it was a kind of cultural assertion, wasn't it? That's right, yeah.
Yes, it was.
So
Yeah.
would there have been a lot of children sacrificed then?
Based on my own reading of the historical accounts, it generally was adults that were sacrificed. I don't think it was necessarily children.
I think it was children as well.
Some children were sacrificed. There were some.
Yeah, I don't think it would be wrong to say that no children were sacrificed.
Children as well. That
yeah.
was part, I understood that I could be wrong, but I understood that was part of the reason why she came.
Mhm.
An indication that she was pregnant, and therefore we're making the point that because she was coming to be shown that she was pregnant,
Mhm.
she treasured that. So don't do what you're doing.
Yes,
Children are to be treasured.
yes. You're absolutely right.
That's my pickup.
Mhm. I think as well, it's difficult when you watch, I don't watch television anyway, but I do like a documentary if I can find something. But I think that we definitely find with the modern historical versions, they're always kind of slanted, and they're always subjective. Like, we'll get the story of the Aztecs, but we never really get the Christianization of Mexico. They always kind of just leave that to the side, as though the Aztecs brought themselves out of paganism, as it were, which they didn't. Yes.
And just also, you were talking about Shroud Turin, and you can't sort of fail not to believe it, even though it's not a dogma of faith.
Yes.
I'd heard that there was at least, this was many years ago, they got 2,000 people to, there were most number non-believers, atheists, Jews, who were given to test it, 2,000
Yeah.
to test it. Most of them, as I say, they were between atheists, all sort of faiths, and very few Catholics. And apparently almost all of them converted after they did the testing of the Turin. Almost all of them
Yes.
converted.
Because it's certainly something I mentioned when I gave the presentation on the Shroud. When we looked at the symposium at the end of the Shroud of Turin research project in 1978, and the 30 in attendance, 30 scientists in attendance, they were asked the outright question, put your hand up if you believe the Shroud is genuine. And I think maybe one hand went up, In fact, I beg your pardon, no hands went up. And then the question was further posed, put your hand up if you believe the Shroud is a forgery. And none of the hands went up. The point that was being made was that they were just terrified for their careers, because they did believe it was genuine, but to say that publicly could put, somebody in harm's way of losing your career. And that always seems to be the case, sadly, in academia. And unfortunately, in academia now, if you're religious, if you believe in God, if you're a Catholic, God forbid, it's like you will have great difficulty furthering your career in academia. I kind of saw that firsthand. But if you're very secular and very worldly, yeah, they'll push you ahead. It's just a sad sort of reality we've found ourselves in the modern world. But anyhow, so I'm going to just, I think we're just going to wrap up. I'm going to ask Father to finish with a prayer, if he doesn't mind, please, Father. And then I'll display the image for you to see, and you can come up at your leisure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Pray for us.
Saint Juan Diego.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father. God bless you. Thank you.
God bless you.
So this came from a company in the States. There are several companies that can produce a replica. So it's produced on canvas. It's very, very similar to what the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe looks like. I don't know if I was given the presentation in the shroud, ladies and gentlemen. This was last year in Glasgow. This elderly lady came up. We had the replica copy, and she said, "Son, this is just wonderful. All those years I've wanted to go to Turin to see the shroud, and here you've brought it to Glasgow." And I says, and I was attempting to tell her it was a replica copy. She was like, "Nothing of the sort. I will not hear of it." She says, "But tell me, son, that was an awfully nice priest in Turin to let you borrow this." This wee lady, God love her, probably never left Glasgow. Just thought there was a city called Turin with a priest, having the shroud of Turin. She says, "I'll let you borrow it and take it to Scotland." So I couldn't tell her it was. I just had to say that it's, Hosanna. So hopefully my plan is to put this in glass, and put a sort of frame. And as you can see, it's much smaller than the shroud of Turin, so it's easier to transport. The shroud can be a bit of a manoeuvre because of its size and length and what have you. And it's heavy as well. But the shroud splits into two sections, whereas I've actually got some frame left, the gold frame that I used to house the shroud replica. So I'm probably going to use that. And I think this is slightly I'll definitely be able to backlight this, to try and enhance the features.
Can we take a photo?
Of course you can. Yeah, listen, by all means, if you want to get a picture beside it, by all means.